Imagine this. It's May of 1945, and the most destructive war in human history has finally come to an end. Adolf Hitler is dead. Berlin is in ruins. Across Europe, the guns have fallen silent, and the Allies are celebrating. Crowds dance in the streets of London, Paris, New York, and Moscow. The world breathes a sigh of relief. After 6 long years of devastation, the nightmare of the Second World War is over. Or at least, that's the story we like to tell ourselves. The truth is much stranger, because for many people, soldiers, civilians, and even entire military garrisons, the war didn't end in May 1945. In scattered corners of the world, German troops kept fighting. Some refused to believe their Führer was dead. Others feared surrender, because they knew exactly what crimes they had committed. And others clung desperately to the fantasy of a new Nazi empire, a Fourth Reich, that might rise from the ashes. Karma. This is the story of the last Nazis who kept holding on after the war was lost. It's a story of denial, of fanaticism, and of men who kept fighting a war that had already ended. When Germany officially surrendered on May 8, 1945, known as VE Day, the paperwork was clear. The Third Reich had ceased to exist. The Nazi government was dissolved. German soldiers were ordered to lay down their arms. But in reality, things were messy. Europe was in chaos. Tens of millions of refugees were on the move, former prisoners of war, concentration camp survivors, civilians fleeing advancing Soviet armies. Roads were clogged with traffic, communications were broken, and many units of the German military were scattered and cut off from orders. Take Norway, for example. At the very northern tip of Europe, the Germans still had more than 350,000 troops stationed in the country when Hitler died. That was nearly as many as had defended Berlin itself. But with their lines of communication severed, they weren't sure what to believe. For days, many officers suspected that Allied radio broadcasts announcing Germany's surrender were just propaganda tricks. They wanted confirmation from Berlin, but Berlin no longer existed. When they finally surrendered, it was May 9th, a full day after the war had ended everywhere else. In the Channel Islands, a group of small, rocky islands off the coast of France, the Germans had been entrenched since 1940. For 5 long years, the Union Jack had been replaced with the swastika. Even after the Reich collapsed, the garrison there refused to budge. They demanded direct confirmation from Hitler's government, which of course no longer existed. Finally, British troops arrived in person to inform them that the war was over. On May 9th, the German commanders reluctantly agreed to surrender. For the civilians who had endured occupation for half a decade, it was a liberation they would never forget. But some holdouts weren't so quick to lay down their arms. In the forests of Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, groups of Waffen-SS and Nazi collaborators decided to fight on. Some of these men were fanatics, indoctrinated in Nazi ideology and unwilling to face the reality of defeat. Others were motivated by fear. They knew that surrendering to the Soviets meant almost certain death. These men had burned villages, executed partisans, and deported civilians to death camps. They had no illusions about what would happen if they were captured, so instead, they disappeared into the forests, carrying out guerrilla attacks long after the war had ended. In Czechoslovakia, one group of SS men continued fighting until mid-May. They launched ambushes on Czech resistance forces and tried to battle their way west, hoping to surrender to the Americans instead of the Soviets. Some of them succeeded. Others were hunted down in the countryside and killed in brutal firefights. By the summer of 1945, organized Nazi resistance in Czechoslovakia had been crushed, but isolated incidents still flared up. In Yugoslavia, similar scenes unfolded. Waffen-SS units and members of the Croatian Ustashi regime attempted to flee the advancing partisans. 4 weeks after the war, the forests and mountains echoed with gunfire as these last-ditch fighters refused to accept defeat. Some were captured and executed on the spot. Others disappeared into the Balkans, vanishing without a trace. And then there were the German U-boats, prowling the oceans. When the surrender came, dozens of submarines were still at sea, cut off from communication. Their captains had a choice: surface and surrender, or continue fighting a hopeless war. Many surfaced, raising white flags and sailing into Allied ports, but not all of them. UTA 977, under the command of Heinz Schäfer, made headlines when it refused to surrender in May 1945. Instead, Schäfer and his crew submerged and fled across the Atlantic. They spent more than 3 months underwater, eventually arriving in Argentina in August. Their surrender caused a sensation. Rumors spread that they had smuggled Nazi leaders or stolen treasures to South America. Although Schäfer denied it, the story of U-977 became part of the legend of Nazis escaping justice to distant shores. Other submarines followed similar paths. U-530 also turned up in Argentina, its crew claiming they had been at sea when the surrender came and had chosen exile over capture. These mysterious arrivals fueled conspiracy theories that Hitler himself had escaped Berlin and fled to South America. While there's no credible evidence for that, the fact that German U-boats were still appearing months after the war added fuel to the fire. But the story of the last Nazis isn't just about soldiers refusing to surrender. It's also about fugitives, high-ranking Nazi officials who tried to escape justice. As the Allies closed in, a secret network developed to smuggle these men out of Europe. Historians call it the Ratlins. With the help of sympathizers in the Catholic Church, fascist governments in Spain, and corrupt officials in Italy, thousands of Nazis managed to flee to new lives overseas. Argentina, Chile, and Brazil became popular destinations. So did the Middle East, where former SS officers offered their expertise to countries hostile to Israel. Among the most notorious fugitives was Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust. After the war, Eichmann was captured by the Americans, but he escaped custody and vanished. Using false papers, he fled through Italy to Argentina, where he lived under the name Ricardo Clement. For more than a decade, he lived a quiet suburban life in Buenos Aires, working in a factory and raising a family. But in 1960, agents of the Israeli intelligence service Mossad tracked him down. In a daring operation, they abducted him, smuggled him out of Argentina, and put him on trial in Jerusalem. Eichmann's trial was broadcast worldwide, exposing the horrors of the Holocaust in unprecedented detail. He was convicted and executed in 1962. Another infamous fugitive was Josef Mengele, the angel of death from Auschwitz. Mengele conducted brutal medical experiments on prisoners, especially children and twins. After the war, he evaded capture, hiding first in Germany, then escaping to South America in 1949. For decades, he lived under various aliases in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. Unlike Eichmann, Mengele was never caught. He drowned in 1979 while swimming off the coast of Brazil. For years, rumors persisted that he was still alive, but DNA testing later confirmed his identity. These men weren't holdouts in the sense of soldiers still fighting, but they represent another way in which Nazism lived on. After 1945, the war might have ended, but justice was delayed for many of its perpetrators. Some Nazis, however, truly did keep fighting. In the years after the war, scattered remnants of German troops clashed with Allied forces. In the Baltic states, for example, bands of so-called Forest Brothers continued a low-level insurgency against Soviet rule. Not all of them were Nazis, many were local nationalists resisting Soviet occupation, but among them were former German collaborators who saw the fight as a continuation of the war against communism. In some areas, violence continued into the early 1950s. And then there's the story of the werewolves. In the final months of the war, the Nazis had trained special guerrilla units known as Werwolf or Werewolf. Their mission was to stay behind enemy lines, sabotage Allied forces, and keep the Nazi cause alive even after defeat. In practice, the werewolf movement was chaotic and poorly organized. Most of their operations fizzled out quickly, but in some areas, especially in occupied Czechoslovakia, werewolf attacks were reported even after the war's official end. It's difficult to separate fact from rumor. Some incidents were exaggerated by Allied propaganda, but the idea of Nazi guerrillas lurking in the shadows helped fuel fears that the Reich wasn't really gone. The question then becomes, who was the very last Nazi? That depends on how you define it. If we're talking about the last organized unit to surrender, some argue it was German troops in isolated parts of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia who fought on into 1947 before being crushed. If we're talking about fugitives, then perhaps Joseph Mengele or Alois Brunner, another high-ranking Nazi who escaped to Syria and lived there under government protection until the 1990s. Brunner had been responsible for deporting tens of thousands of Jews to their deaths. He lived in Damascus, where he reportedly advised the Syrian intelligence service. According to some reports, he died as late as 2001, more than half a century after the fall of the Third Reich. So in a sense, the war never really ended in May 1945. For some, it dragged on 4 weeks, for others, years, and for a handful of men, the legacy of Nazism stretched across decades. Even as the world tried to rebuild and move forward, the shadow of Hitler's regime lingered on. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part of the story. Wars don't end neatly with signatures on a piece of paper. They leave scars, they leave fugitives, and they leave unfinished business. The Allies may have defeated the Third Reich, but for decades afterwards, the hunt for Nazis continued. The war's final chapter was still being written long after the guns had gone silent. So the next time you hear that World War II ended in May of 1945, remember that the truth is more complicated. For the last Nazis, the war went on, some in forests, some in submarines, some hiding in faraway countries under false names. The world had moved on, but they had not. Subscribe to the History Front.